The afternoon session is on sustaining development, inhabiting urban and rural space. The rules are that I have a little timer here. We will be allowing each of the panelists 18 minutes so as to genuinely allow some time for discussion at the end. And our panelists will be given a 5-minute and 2-minute warning, and then the beeper is just going to go off. Our first speaker is Sheldon Brown from UCSD, Director of the Center for Research and Computing in the Arts, where he's Professor of Visual Arts, and his presentation is entitled Representation and Development, the Scalable City in China.
Well, thank you for having me here. I'm maybe a bit of an outlying data point in terms of my field in relationship to the rest of the conference, but connects, I think, in a very important way, and it connects in the how do we know way. So I'm an artist. And I've been doing some projects in China the last few years, and came to that not necessarily because of a specific interest in things Chinese, but that there were certain things taking place in China that have a level of profundity in relationship to my issues of concern at large that makes my engagement in China, absolutely necessary. And so I want to just lay a couple of stakes out about what I think art brings to this understanding of how do we know things. Art is a means of a critical and an examined cultural perception. It's not a unreflected upon reception of meanings. It's one where artists try to actively engage the meaning-making mechanisms of the viewer. And the artist is trying to create sublime works that kind of transcend normative types of representation. And some of us have, the goals of trying to provoke cultural and social transformation by these works. So in particular, I'm going to talk about a work that I've been developing and was shown in Shanghai last year called The Scalable City. And it's an artwork that engages issues of urban development and its representation. And so I'm in general, very interested in issues about representation and how representation applies to development, for instance. So here's a model of the future of the riverbanks that run through Shanghai at the Urban Design Museum in People's Park there, and models of representation or models of development, I think, are very tricky things. They're obviously crucial in the development of urban environments. They use particular visual and symbolic vocabularies that abstract what the final form is. So we use models and plans as shortcuts, as abstractions to better understand the larger scope of what a final plan might be. And to aid this, people who do these things, they use the models to explicate certain intellectual concerns that they have embedded within these projects, and that the stakes of those concerns might not have as much apparency when kind of encountered in the real world with the kind of mix and chaos of that context. So representations are meant to create understanding and also desire. So they're also vehicles of promotion for projects, right? And so these kind of means of understanding and cultivation of desire can easily be in conflict with each other. So upstairs at that same museum, they have a model of Shanghai in 2020, I believe, and it's quite awe-inspiring that they have gone through, and this is just maybe 1/5 of the entire model. It takes up a floor of a room about the size of this room that we're in right now. And you navigate it up on mezzanines around it. And it's amazingly impressive in terms of articulating the amount of concrete and steel that will be employed in the coming decade. But it's hard to capture some of the other things about the future city of Shanghai in this model. It's much more difficult to capture the atmosphere above Shanghai in this time. It's much more difficult to capture the flow, how, the actual movement from one part of the city to another. It's difficult to capture the what actually takes place with all of the natural systems in this environment. Traffic flow isn't represented in this model. So many things. So the things that are there are very awe-inspiring. I've had colleagues of mine who say visiting this model changed their worldview because of its scale, and that's not much of an overstatement. And so one of the things that we often do when we're trying to make these schemes of representation, a model or a plan, is we're trying to make them coherent. So they become a standalone, coherent artifact. And in that role, they further problematize what might have been their initial impetus, namely trying to convey the implications of the final form. And I'm not a deep expert in China, in the history of planning documents in China, but I'm very struck by certain things that seem to occur in urban design plans that are quite different from how they're approached in the West. Just a couple of kind of quick examples. This is a design for an area of Beijing in development, and you can tell from the drawing here, it's very much it's very pastoral. It's very much a park-like setting that is being conveyed here, and it also seems to have another kind of level of structure within this park-like setting when you see it from a plan view. And in fact, it's got this kind of metaphorical underpinning that this surely must be a very rational space because it's developed along the lines of a brain map. Now, this is another maybe different Rorschach test, for what you think you might be seeing in this plan. And it's further reinforced in the detail area, where they show this island as a little fetus within this another metaphorical human anatomy. We also could have the Buddha figure as a design scheme, or the dragon. And so here's a nice little story that you probably can't read, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it talks about finding this piece of land, and once upon a time a dragon was flying over, and he was thirsty, so he landed there, and he really liked it. And so years later, so he fell asleep, and then years later he turned into stone, and his body became a pedestrian mall, and his feet became a sloping road, and his head became the convention center and hotel. And so then the upper drawing is the final, the final scheme, without dragon, and then below they've kind of colored back in the forms of the dragon. So this operation of metaphor in these design documents, it serves a very complicated role. You can see it as really a kind of sales pitch for these developments, that they can imbue these kind of shared cultural stories. But these types of use of metaphor and narrative are, in fact, I would argue, really necessary to aid in the in bringing coherency to the rapid developments that are taking place in China's built environment. But maybe they're not quite the most effective means of representation that could be used there. They're, maybe what needs to happen are new schemes of representation that can utilize emerging techniques of data visualization and simulation, which can provide complexity and coherency to these types of activities, but maybe without the need to employ kind of external narrative structures that have little relevance to the final thing. So along those lines, I've been thinking in general about urbanity and its representation and development, and have been developing a project called the Scalable City, which I showed, as I mentioned, I showed in Shanghai earlier this year, and it tries to look at the given environment as a starting point, and then taking that given environment into algorithmic systems that kind of examine, identify patterns, and then further complexify those patterns. And so these first couple of images are prints that come from that series. And the project in Shanghai was done as an interactive installation, like a large-scale video game. And I'm going to show two video clips. The first video clip is a movie that kind of moves through this. It's about 4 minutes long. And then I'll show a 1-minute clip of the installation environment. So I guess this is as dark as it gets in here. So I'm looking for investors to help me build that outside of Shanghai. And I'll just start this next video and talk over it. So that is a kind of narrative movie about it. But generally the project is experienced, and this is how it was set up at MoCA, as a interactive installation. So you as a user, the lighting is very hard makes it hard to see the video, but there's a glowing blue light and green light there, and that's actually a user interface. There's people standing there, and they are embodied within this environment as one of those vortices of automobiles that spews into the air continuously. And so as they drive that spewing vortex of automobiles through this landscape, they cause this system of roads to grow out into the environment in front of them. And their vortex, when it encounters debris, it throws that debris in the air, and that debris has little bits of knowledge embedded within it, so that when it lands, it tries to recombine into architectural forms. So there's this, and there's another set of screens in this in the museum that show different aspects of this kind of data visualization as urbanization scheme pipeline. Maybe it'll cut to it in a second. Maybe not. Oh, yeah. So then there are other types of kind of cinematic engagements with this data that take it through different levels of abstraction. Is that my 18 minutes? Oh my God, okay. I promised I was going to be short. So here I'm actually, so I'm trying to be provocative with all these gestures, provocative to think about implications of development and the kind of tools we bring to both kind of visualize and structure that development. So for the roads, I use this L system, which is an algorithm used to simulate plant growth. And here use it to control this branching structure of Archimedes spirals into the landscape, which has a logic to it. And it has a certain kind of space efficiency. It's a space filling curve, but it's meant to be both decorative, compelling, but also it hopefully shows kind of the social operation might leave some things to be desired. The architecture is this image form collage. So it's not quite an image and it's not quite an object. It's kind of in between, in an in-between space, operating as a kind of suburban ideal. And this suburban ideal is what I found is I've shown this work in China, in India, in Eastern Europe. It encapsulates this kind of American suburban ideal that's been really kind of that really hangs out there as a target for development. So the whole world wants to look like Southern California in some way, and so again, I'm hopefully putting that into a place of a little more critical engagement, and then the automobile system, which is how the whole thing gets enacted, is. It's this mixture of nature and cultural motifs that get caught up within this one system. So obviously trying to make a connection, back to the implications of this into a kind of larger ecosystem set of ramifications. And I'll leave with just showing a clip from a project that's in development. We're working on a exhibition next year in Beijing about the city. So thinking about the past, the present, and the future of the city. And in particular, how it's extended, how all of these things kind of intersect with its mediations and its digital extensions. And so I'm developing a project called the Beijing Velodrome. And the Velodrome, and this is a very early visualization. So you're looking into my sketchbook here. This will be another interactive interactive installation which will operate as a bicycle race through a kind of collage of Beijing in the form of a velodrome. And a velodrome is a bicycle racing coliseum that's shaped in a ring road. And so trying to, go back to certain things about the structure of Shanghai. And there's engagements with the atmosphere, and and the atmosphere is one of the dynamic elements within the activity that obscures and clarifies depending upon activities. And so right now I'm in Beijing taking photographs, trying different techniques of capturing the data from the ground there as I start to build the engine to do this project. But the project itself will be, the exhibition at the museum will be lots of different projects that try and look at how we understand the city in present, how we remember it from the past, and how we think about its future by its extension in digital mediation. So I'll stop there.
Our next speaker is Harrison Fraker, who is the Dean of the College of Environmental Design right here at UC Berkeley. And he will be presenting on what do we know about China's gated superblock development model.
While we're
changing over.
While we're changing. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
While they're changing the technology here, I can't wait to ask Sheldon whether that was a critical or glorifying of a suburban nightmare or suburban rape and pillage.
Yes.
Let me begin by, again, like everybody else, thanking Tom for inviting me to come to this. I come to lots of conferences with architects, landscape architects, planners, engineers, and to come to this conference where there's so many different perspectives on what's going on in China, it's a real privilege. And the whole purpose for this is to get a lot of information in front of you so you can criticize me. I'm a designer. I'm trained as an architect and an urban designer. And I like to think of design as a way of exploring, imagining, interrogating a set of questions. And what I'm going to try to run through today very quickly is an alternative to the gated superblock development model by first looking at the model, showing you very quickly an alternative, and then trying to interrogate that model about the social and cultural dimensions that it represents. So I'm going to go very quickly. So let's see. I got to find my little thing down here. So we all know this. It's the most rapidly developing country in the world. It's going to double its built environment in the next 20 to 30 years. That's 2 Great Britons, for Isabel's information. It's 10 to 12 million housing units a year. Every day, China builds 10 to 15 of these gated communities. The gated communities are a very, very efficient way of building housing. The city lays out a grid of arterial streets at roughly a half to 1 kilometer square. They usually oversize those tremendously in anticipation of the traffic, and they sell the development rights to the property on the inside. This is the single largest economic engine that supports cities, and that's why it is so amazingly robust in China. If you do a Google Earth and look at every city, you can see the emerging grid of arterials and the development blocks that are going to be sold. So what happens? The developer usually puts a fence around the block, creates a gate, has a guardhouse. Every time you drive in and out, you're saluted. And it looks like this. We'll talk about models. And the developer has to build a specified number of housing units, commercial, schools. There's a program determined by the city. The consequences are extraordinary to the urban fabric. It almost guarantees dependence on the car. It destroys the walkability and bikeability of the typical urban fabric. Sometimes you have to walk 2 kilometers to get to something that's only 200 meters away. Access to public transit becomes extremely difficult unless it's right at the front door. The traffic congestion in the arterials is outrageous once you've built many of these. And the CO2 emissions that are linked to this are absolutely staggering when you think of the material used to build it, the electricity required to operate it, and the transportation necessary to support it. We've seen everything about this. I don't have to say anything more. The superblock depends on an incredibly expensive centralized infrastructure support system. You've got to build power plants, 1 every week or so, water treatment plants, 1 every week or so, sewage treatment, 1 every week or so, and you need lots of landfill. And China is behind on this. So in many cases, the developer has to supply this locally. We've proposed an alternative to this, which is what we're calling the eco-block. We want to make these neighborhoods completely resource self-sufficient, to be, in fact, their own little complete energy system. Generate all their own energy, recycle all their own water, and process all their own waste. We're going to do this in Qingdao. I won't give you the history. We've been working on this, basically since 2000. And finally, we're going to do the first one in Qingdao. The site is along the first bus rapid transit system in Qingdao, connects the downtown to a high-tech development area. This is the typical, remember the picture that I showed you of all those towers? That's what was going to go on this site. It's 700 meters by 700 meters, and I have something I can point with. This is where the transit stop is going to be, right there. I'm going to go really fast. So this is about whole systems design thinking. It's not about thinking about energy different from water, different from heating, cooking, waste, food, etc. It's putting it all together. So first of all, in Qingdao, there's a good wind resource. If we put building integrated wind machines on the tops of the tall buildings, it will provide roughly 50% of the energy. If we put PVs on the roofs and use it as shading devices, about 40%. The question is, where do we get the rest? And this is the key. We get it from the waste systems. Food waste from the kitchen, green waste from the landscape, we'll talk about that in a second, and the sludge from the first phase of sewage treatment. Oops, did it go off? There. All goes to a 2-phase anaerobic digester. The first phase absorbs, reduces all the solids. The second phase makes methane or hydrogen. You can custom design this with these new technologies. It runs a backup electric generator. All of these feed the neighborhood grid. So that's where the energy comes from. The grid could have backup to the regional grid, but it doesn't need it. The second system, which is the key, is the water. We can start anywhere in the loop. Let's take 100% drinking water, goes to the sinks, it's used for the showers, comes down, it's joined with toilet water and washing water. The sludge is taken out. That means that the water is relatively easy to clean. You can use constructed wetlands and living machines to clean the water to very high levels. You can recycle that to water the landscape. You can recycle it for your toilet and your washing machine. And with a little extra reverse osmosis and ultraviolet, you make it very, very high quality water. This has all been carefully engineered. The water quality is better than the World Health Organization in every single category. So the water is completely cycled. So what's happened? The building has become a platform for energy. The food has become energy. The landscape has become energy. The waste system has become energy, and all the water is recycled. All proven technologies. We've evaluated in every single category multiple companies and picked the best ones. And this is what happens in the energy sector. You optimize the design of the facade, you use natural ventilation, passive heating, daylighting, efficient lighting, and you're 40% down on the normal loads. The rest comes from the three sources that I described: photovoltaics, wind, and the anaerobic digester. Water, same thing, big conservation effort. Then you have rainwater, you have the various levels of treatment supply almost all the rest. Let's talk about transportation quickly. This neighborhood is transit-oriented. We want to have everybody have a car, but we don't want to have them to have to use it every day. Look at these mode shares. China, 80% pedestrians and bikes today, even though it's changing rapidly. Look at the US, 90. Look at the EU, 50% cars and a split here. This is Japan. What's China going to be? If China goes the way of the US, China will have twice as many cars as the whole world has today. And the CO2 emissions are staggering. So what we've done is created the BRT and make pedestrian routes directly to the public transit for most of your uses, so you can use your car when you want to. What about costs? Obviously, the key thing, the developer has to spend more money up front. What normally would happen is the developer would build this. How much time do I have still? Okay. Normally what the developer would do is just build it, sell it, the user would pay the utility. Now we're trying to set up a situation where the developer is the property manager, the homeowner pays for the utilities directly to them, and since the government benefits, they can provide a lower land cost or low interest loans to help support this. What we're trying to do is create a win for the city, a win for the developer, and a win for the homeowner, and not moralize about this. This is a better system. It makes money for the developer. Everybody wins. There are some externalities. I won't go through all of them, but just look at this. There are 5,000 units of housing there. This is how many tons of carbon are reduced by this system. If we add the car usage saved, it doubles this. It's almost 24,000 tons a year. If there's a cap and trade system, this is all gravy for either the developer or the city. So let's talk a minute about the social implications of all of this. Why gated communities? Is China just copying Orange County? Is China Orange County on steroids? No, I don't think so. The idea of identity and gatedness is so culturally bound. What is the Forbidden City? It's the world's most well-known gated community. What is a huton? Huton. It's a family gated community. So when you go to China and you ask them, why are these gated communities so popular? They may give you an answer about safety, but it's the idea that you belong to a community. You're identified with a particular place. The tragedy is, look what gets lost. There is this rich urban culture that is almost sanitized out of the process. Remember these things? You see any of that in there? What's really ironic, I wish I had the slides to show you this. Lots of times, a whole city builds up in these arterials informally, and it's illegal, and it basically blocks the street because there's no service in here like that. This is the landscape in between. You park your car at the perimeter, you walk on meandering paths. You're usually not allowed to walk on the grass. See that? And you go to your unit. So you're buying a unit and you're buying identity. We want to do something very different. And I'll try to run through what it is and go through some of the social assumptions. And it has to do with a very different attitude about the landscape. First of all, we've created streets and private courtyards. So we're trying to create the gated community at the scale of the urban block. Either that scale. We have a lot of variety as to which gated block you could belong to and buy into. Rather than being 10,000 units of housing, it's 300 units of housing, which is much more sociable. This fits the amazing Chinese system of having not only your family support system, which is extended, but the neighborhood organization that you know, that introduces you to all your friends, that maintains the neighborhood. And you can do that at this intermediate scale. So we're trying to do something halfway between the Huton and the Forbidden City. In the middle of these blocks, we think you can have landscape. You can grow your food. We don't know yet whether that will be seen as a plus or a minus. But these are potentially community gardens. And we've estimated that these communities can grow 40% of their produce using that land. All the other things are, we're using the streets to clean the stormwater. We're using the park area to clean the sewage. We're using trees as fruit trees to also grow food, but they also suck up carbon. Look at all the functions of the landscape. Reduces the heat island effect. It absorbs carbon and creates wonderful aromatic places. It treats the stormwater. It treats the wastewater, the sewage. It makes food. It creates the biomass for the energy. It's aesthetic. This is usually all you get. It has healing effects. It's a recreational area, and it really gives you a sense of community. Now, how many of those gated communities perceive the landscape that way? And this is an immensely powerful cultural tradition in China. It's sort of recapturing that. We don't know how well it's going to take yet, but we wanted to put it forward. So this just shows you, again, you know, a block. This is about 300 units, okay? This is similar, but it's with tall buildings. These are the bioswales that clean the water. This is what cleans the sewage. They're trees. These are the gardens. Just so you can see this. This cleans all the stormwater so you can use it. This cleans all the sewage so you can use it. And you can have agriculture in the middle of the blocks. So what we're trying to propose in a design way, in a proactive way, is a very different alternative to the superblock. We're arguing that you can make these neighborhoods completely resource self-sufficient. And by doing that, you can provide reconnections to a whole bunch of cultural history that the superblocks seem to be erasing. So I'd love to hear your comments about this. It's a very different model. The exciting thing is the city of Qingdao the mayor has just agreed to do this. We have funding from both the Moore Foundation and Paul Allen's Vulcan Foundation, and perhaps the Energy Foundation, to go ahead with this. The Minister of Construction, Vice Minister Cho, wants to build 3 or 4 of these as national demonstration projects around the country to show that it's not just a one-off model, that this is scalable. Remember, we talked about scalability. If this works, the Chinese will copy this, because if all of these things work together, it really is a win for everybody. Thank you.
Terrific. Our next speaker is Mark Henderson from Mills College, who will be presenting on urbanization, land conservation, and climate change.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Hear me now? I too am very pleased to be here and to see this conference succeeding so well, and thank the organizers, Tom Gold. It's good to be back at Berkeley with some of my mentors and to see colleagues who've gone on to great things, including I'll mention Kristen McDonald, who's Berkeley's newest PhD working on rivers. Amazing group that's come together. Been a few years ago, it was a handful, and now it's a crowd. Many of the points I'd like to make this afternoon have already been made over the course of the last 2 days. Perhaps what I can do is give a different source of data or alternatives that might help us triangulate on what's the truth and where we might go forward. I'd also like to mention that I rely quite a bit on environmental scientists, colleagues in the People's Republic of China who clearly, as has been mentioned over the last day or two, reach for and are achieving a world standard. It's not that they need technological transfer from environmental scientists here, but it's certainly true that the US does have a responsibility to continue to be engaged in China and to work with our Chinese colleagues. The statistic that 20% of China's emissions may be credited to the export market should be enough of a reason for us to continue to be engaged, and I hope our activities are seen in that light. I'm going to make 3 points in the short time that I have available. The first of these is that China is likely already seeing the effects of climate change, and that further effects could well be catastrophic. Therefore, action at all levels is quite urgent, and that would include the local level, as we've just seen in the last 2 presentations. A second point is that urbanization is one of the most important, but also one of the most tractable phenomena. I'm very glad to follow Dean Fraker in this and showing that there are alternative designs. Policy choices can be made now that will make a difference. We're going to be living with the urban design choices now for generations to come, not just in how people live, but how they get around and the impacts of transportation and so forth on climate change. So now is a really good time to be working on this. And finally, third point, that there is a high level of variation, of local variation in urban growth rates and in the causes and effects of climate change. That we may need to look for regional transfers of resources, recognizing that some areas are unduly being afflicted by the effects of climate change, some areas are providing ecosystem services on which other areas depend, and that this can be an important part of a sustainable land conservation policy. So let me look a bit first at some of the evidence that China is currently already seen effects of climate change. Here's a paper I wrote with some Chinese colleagues using data from the China Meteorological Administration. I'd like to remark that China set up a comprehensive national weather monitoring system. In the early days after liberation, Chairman Mao and Stalin had a conversation, and one of Stalin's suggestions for China was to go and set up a technological system to monitor the weather, and all of that particular technology transfer experience didn't go so well. The network was up and operating by 1960, and we have that data now. I think it's important to use this data from China, get it out into international science. It's quite reliable. We've assessed it very thoroughly. It's very standardized at the world standards. Nonetheless, it was interesting, although this data had been shared through a protocol with the US Department of Energy, when we published this paper, we got quite a bit of flack, or my colleagues did, for sharing it with the international community. There was distress that we were somehow giving away state secrets by reporting on weather and temperature and precipitation over the past few years. So this still is a concern that we have to deal with. What I'm showing here is the daily temperature range, which is the difference between nighttime and daytime temperatures, at about 300 climate stations operated by the central government across China. And these are the trends. Hollow dots are positive, increasing range between night and day, and you don't see too many of those. Solid dots, which you see quite a few of, are decreasing range. And what this is evidence that nighttime temperatures have been increasing quite a bit faster than daytime temperatures over most of this period. While this may be just obscure meteorological phenomena, well, crops do depend on diurnal cycles of cold and warm systems. It also affects things like how much air conditioners do you have to run in the urban centers. So urban heat island effect, in fact, could be exacerbated by this if it doesn't cool off at night, their health effects and so forth. All right, another meteorological item of importance from the same source, precipitation. And so we've heard quite a bit about water shortages in China. Well, one important contributor to this is where's the rain falling. And here the solid dots are declines in rainfall, and you'll see all across the Yellow River Basin and the North China Plain, large trends towards decreasing rainfall. But down in the area of where Professor Gong was talking about yesterday, the Yangtze River Basin, areas where we're concerned about flooding, we have increasing trends over this period. And another point that was brought up earlier in the far west, but it applies to much of China, is that rainfall is becoming less frequent but more intense. So in one of our studies, we find that very mild, sort of misty conditions, light showers, nearly disappear over the course of this record, whereas severe flooding from intense storms is even more of a problem than before. So we've done several of these studies with the Chinese data, and many variables show the trends that are expected by global climate models. So confirming with Chinese data that some of the findings of this warnings of international science do in fact affect China. We also find a lot of turning points in these around the 1980s and early 1990s, which is also what we expect based on global levels of carbon in the atmosphere. So these effects are not just out in the far west of China or in often obscure natural zones, but they're also affecting the urban centers of the eastern coast. And just to give one sense of how this might affect populations, I'm starting a study using Chinese census data, another source of data from the Chinese government. This one is, rather than being hidden away, is being commercialized and being sold at very high prices to outsiders who want to know how to market their products. And fortunately for academics, we've been able to get a cut rate deal on this. But I have a map of different demographic characteristics of cities across China, and this one's showing just population centers of over 50,000 on the North China Plain and on down to Shanghai. The thing to look at here is proximity to the coastline. Peter Perdue gave us a deeper historical appreciation of these situations. The coastline of China as it exists today is a fairly new phenomenon. It wasn't always like this, and in fact it's a wholly anthropogenic phenomenon. Both siltation from the major river systems and pushing agriculture out into the marshes has shaped this coastline. And it can be changed again. Much of China's coastal areas have in fact been extended. And the same phenomenon applies down in the Pearl River Delta as well. Sea level rise could have some catastrophic consequences here. So here I've added the, shaded in dark blue, the 2-meter contour. Significant areas in Jiangsu and also around Tianjin, down at those low levels that might be worried about inundation or storm surges in conditions of increased sea level. If we want to continue to look at 5 meters, now the likelihood of sea level rise of 5 meters is not that accepted, but we have the related problem of land subsidence, whereas groundwater is pumped out, the land is lowering itself. So if you're close to the coast, this might be a problem. And look, we've got increasingly populated areas. In fact, there are a total of about 60 million people under that 5 million, under that 5-meter contour. Lately, the possibility of the collapse of the Greenland or the West Antarctic ice sheets has been raised. This could raise sea levels, in either case, up to about 10 meters, and that gives us 90 million more people in this zone. Talk about urban infrastructure costs and dislocations that are possible. And if you want to get really catastrophic, 25 meters would include the East Antarctic ice sheet. 138 million more people. Shenyang and Jinan become oceanfront properties. The point here is not to scare everyone or send you running for the hills, but to give a sense of the magnitude of preparations that might be necessary, the dislocations to people and to urban infrastructure that could result if we don't take urban action, urgent action, and to call on some of these are the most developing, most rapidly developing, and most prosperous areas of China, that they will have a local interest in seeing this problem solved. Lots of people are working on carbon emissions from energy sector, industrial sector, transport sector, and that's very important work. But I want to point to land management as another area to consider. Here's, by the way, a graph, cumulative populations at different levels. If you add all of those elevation contours up to 25 meters, you can get nearly 300 million people in affected areas, very close to the population of the United States. All right, so land use and land management does affect the carbon cycle. Different land cover types, as you may know, store different amounts of carbon. Forests are great. There's great talk of planting trees and restoring natural areas as carbon sinks. This has been an American strategy for a while, trying to get credit for doing this. Vegetation in all its form also breathes carbon naturally. If you've seen the annual graphs where carbon goes in and out of the cycle annually, even as it's rising on a long-term basis. The amount that carbon is taken into the natural system varies quite a bit depending on land cover type, on latitude, and on, of course, climate. Changing land cover type, of course, then changes carbon storage, but it mostly reduces. The direction is mostly towards the right side of this graph. The other category here would include urban uses. So I went to look at China using satellite imagery to see where is vegetation changing and what implications might that have for carbon storage. This is data from a US meteorological satellite called AVHRR, and NDVI stands for the Normal Differential Vegetation Index, a tricky way of measuring how much vegetation is down there on the ground. And over the course of the 1990s, there's some statistically significant trends for where vegetation is increasing or, in the most part, decreasing. My question was, well, how does this relate to urbanization as a type of land use change that we can have some policy control over? And for that, I turned to another meteorological satellite, this from the US Defense Department. Having the Defense Department's budget, they didn't want to wait for the sun to come up to see what the weather would be, so they built a satellite that could see at night. And you've probably seen some of these maps that have gotten tossed around of the lights of cities at night. It was a side effect of the meteorological satellite that they could see what we were all doing at night. This is a composite showing changes in the city systems of China as evidenced by those nighttime lights over the course of the 1990s. And at this point, I always pause for a geography lesson to see what this island is floating off of China. And you'll realize that that's South Korea, and the dark spot here is North Korea with Pyongyang there. So as an indicator of development, these lights might have something to tell us. Well, over the course of the 1990s, we see quite a lot of increase both in intensity and the extent of urbanization in China. And so my question was to bring that back to land cover and say, well, how has that affected? One thing for this conference, I did think 2000 data is woefully out of date for any conversation about China, and I'm being rapidly turned back into a historian, which was my first academic pursuit. But I did bring up the data for 2006 from the satellite has just been released in the last couple of months. And we can see just a few changes in that area. If you make out the white against the purple, and I'm not sure how this will show up here, filling in some infill in the North China Plain, a few new cities or developments out here. We have a nice ring around, I think that's Nanchang here, and some transportation corridors out in the west that are showing up nicely lit there that have been built or come online since 2000. Pearl River Delta filling in also. Also offshore lights too, which is either fishing or transport. All right, so how does this, at least up to 2000, and you'll have to get back to me on what's happened since then, how does this affect vegetation? Well, using geographic information systems technology to put these two together, we can see where does vegetation change coincide or not with urbanization. And we have that big area you probably saw first out in the western deserts where we're losing vegetation. Well, that's not a lot of urbanization going on out there, but it is evidence that the vegetation, such as there is out in the deserts, is thinning. This isn't unexpected given what we've heard about water resources out there. Also fits in with global climate models about declining precipitation and in the deserts. Two areas where we've got more vegetation, and this needs to be recognized, though we need a little more research on the causes and consequences. One is up in southern Manchuria, or northeast China, as they prefer to call it, the northern rice bowl, where marshlands are showing up as greener. That may be evidence of more agriculture being pushed up into this area, and there is a program to do that. Secondly, around the Three Gorges Dam, interestingly, becomes greener. Now, that may be evidence of increased rainfall, or it may be resettlement out of the valleys and planting up in the hillsides to control erosion. That's important to take note of. But neither of those particularly relevant to urbanization. It's the three main urban centers of China, the North China Plain with Beijing, Tianjin, the Yangtze River Delta centered on Shanghai, and the Pearl River Delta centered on Hong Kong and Guangzhou, where we have the most evident change and its negative growth in terms of vegetation. And I've got one of these super blocks, I think, here on my photo from the airplane being built out into the farmland around Beijing. Okay, so I wanted to say that in terms of carbon storage, the conversion of all of that land around cities, mostly cropland, to urban, we can estimate that that would be a reduction in carbon sequestration of about 300 million tons annually. And for comparison, that's about twice the carbon sequestration capacity of all of the forests in the United States. So here we're trying to plant a few forests and get worldwide credit for being for taking some carbon out of the air, given how much we put out there. But a year's worth of development in China can take that out and double and put it back into the atmosphere. So clearly need some better approaches than we've managed to do here. I think it's also important to take this look to a local level and also look back deeper in history. And so what I was able to do here at Berkeley was find maps from exactly 100 years ago, Prussian survey of the North China, documented at very good scale, 1 to 100 or 200,000, the footprint of every village in the North China Plain, mapped and labeled in this very obscure German romanization. But nonetheless, link that up with more recent satellite data, some from the US, some that's actually only available through my Chinese colleagues. And look how towns and villages have expanded over the past century. Putting together maps from a series of different dates, 1907, 1957, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and finding that the urban growth that we see, with the exception of a few large cities, is really a recent phenomena dating from the 80s and 90s. It's not that there's been a gradual expansion of cities with population, as you might expect if you didn't know the economic situation in China, but this is all very new and thus very much a product of the current policy environment. So here in this one area, Zouping in Shandong province, urban growth really picks up in the 1990s. Yet at the same time, some of the villages have just about the same urban footprint that they did at the time of that 1907 survey, which raises some questions about how different places, even within close proximity, are developing. Certainly it's great from a vegetation measure that they're still as vegetated around the outside as they were at some previous time, but we do have some concerns about the equity of, and the distribution of development. That's true both on a local scale and then back at the national scale. One last view from the a composite of census data, trying to give an index of development at different levels. The take-home message here that I'd like to give is that both at local and countrywide scales, urban development remains very uneven. Likewise, the environmental costs borne by different areas and different people are very uneven. A lot of people are not necessarily benefiting from development, or they are suffering more than their share of the costs. The existing policy matrix very much favors land development despite the logging ban, despite quotas on farmland conversion. Most of the incentives for the local governments are all to the side of development. We need green cities like the ones we just heard about, and an incentive structure to match from the wider policy structure to make a difference. The US experience in this has not been all positive, but I think it can be instructive. And as Pochi Wu said this morning, we may not be providing solutions, but we can provide tools, and those can be applied. Thank you very much.
Absolutely perfect timing. Our next and final speaker is Shannon May, who is a graduate student fellow in the anthropology department here at UC Berkeley. And she will be speaking on a quite vexed topic, I believe, how much arable land is really out there.
Okay, so I'm really grateful to be speaking with you today, and thankful to Tom and to Hillary and to Daniel, who were able to pull this conference together for all of us. It's been an amazing 2 days for me personally, and I'm hoping that in what I am able to speak to you today, that you'll take some of the amazing wealth of data and experiences that we've all been able to share about water quality, air quality, urbanization, and then try into your mind to imagine that you are that person who is drinking that water, who is breathing that air, who is having less rainfall, and is somehow in their mind trying to make a coherence out of a radical change in the worlds in which they live. So while the question I am trying to answer today is a nationally important one, I'm going to get to that answer through a very small village. So if we want to understand how much land is under cultivation in the countryside in China, that question has been at the heart of political debates, since back into the 40s, since the original turning over the land back to the tiller, and the earliest uses of fanshan. And it still remains at the heart of political debates in China today. We've heard it through this weekend of the importance of thinking through the juggernaut of having 22% of the world's population, but 7% of the land, and how do we think through the three rural problems, which are always broached together into this knotted knowledge of the countryside, the farmer, and agriculture. And I want us to try to pay attention to that triplet, and to hear the cadence of how that affects politics and development in China today. So in this village, Huangbai, which is in the eastern mountains of Liaoning province, last fall, I met with one of the gentlemen, a 75-year-old party member who lives in this village, and he grabbed me on the pathway, and he told me that it was time to xiuzheng. I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean? For what reform? And he said that he felt it was time, like in 52, like in 68, for the country to turn back to the countryside and to hear what it had to say. But his perspective on what reform is necessary in China comes from this village, from living in a narrow village in a high mountainous area where he has been since his birth. But many of us also think that that we could all benefit from changes, both in the rest of our world and in China, looking at various environmental changes that we could all work on. But most of our experiences come from a very different perspective than this man, who, by the way, insisted the entire year and a half I knew him that I call him comrade. So I brought this up, many of you will know, it's late on a Friday and Saturday, and you're all here past 4, so in the back of my mind, I often thought about, even now, in agriculture, what are we studying? So many of you came of age in a time of your own research where you all heard, 农业学大寨. So I would like to, maybe in a spirit of, Saturday afternoon, think about if in 农业 we study Huangbai, what lessons are we going to learn? So from there, this is the perspective that most of us think about environmental problems, global warming, that inspires much of our work. And in many of the other speeches over the past couple of days, we've seen variations of this image. And in this image where, in 1969, when we came to see this, we crossed a scientific and political threshold of where many of you may know the work of Bill McDonough, and he's involved in this project I'll speak about, as he calls for the next industrial revolution. He specifically talks about, when we see this image, away went away. The limits of our natural resources are there in front of our eyes. And there are no more political boundaries. You can't see them from this perspective. The air, the water, it all moves freely. So we have to take responsibility for our shared community of fate, with people who are not just in our own country, in our own government, but across the world. And we've heard about all the different ways that American consumption is a significant contributor to pollution in China. And taking that seriously of how we will come through our perspectives of what should happen in urbanization and rural development in China. So, but one thing to remember, as a point perhaps, is that gentleman, my dear comrade, he's never seen the earth this way. And so when he thinks of his life, he only sees it from that small view in the village. But so here's another view of the village of Huangbai, or what a model hopes that one day it might become. And there's a project in Huangbayu, which is a joint project by the China-US Center for Sustainable Development, which is a very complex organization, but is based both in Portland and in Beijing. On the Chinese side, it is co-chaired by Deng Nan, who's Deng Xiaoping's daughter, for those of you who might not know. And at the time of its organization, she was the vice minister of the Ministry of Science and Technology. But the home base for this group in China is in the Administrative Center for China's Agenda 21. And on the US side, it's based out of the International Sustainable Development Foundation in Portland and co-chaired by Bill McDonough. And like many of us, they're very concerned about sustainable development in general and what can be done through partnerships, transnational partnerships. And after the first couple years of their organization, they decided where they really wanted to put their emphasis, to put their money where their mouth was to do a sustainable development demonstration village. And after some original speccing, they chose the location Huangbayu. And so as you can see here, the goal of this cradle-to-cradle village, which was set to be the rural standard for development in China when this was beginning with partnership with the Ministry of Land and Resources and the Ministry of Construction, the goal was that there might be able to be standards created from this demonstration project, maybe perhaps a little bit like Dazhai, that then could be rolled out across 600,000 villages all over China. And so they were very much thinking about how we could demonstrate, learn lessons here, take it through the rest of the country. So part of the environmental background to this project was it was supposed to be powered by the sun. There'd be biomass gasification for heating and cooking. In McDonough's terms, for those who might not be familiar with it, biological nutrients can all be recycled back into biological systems. Technical nutrients, such as plastic, should all be able to be upcycled in his terms. And through all of this, the quality of life for rural residents should be improved. And most importantly, or just as importantly as the alternative energy principles in this project, were that the human population was to be centralized and consolidated to optimize valuable productive land. And to go a little bit more into the land values behind this project is there are 830 mu of land being cultivated by residents in this village, according to government data. And to consolidate the village, which is currently in 9 districts, or really in kind of 11 spread out natural villages, to consolidate them all into this little smaller area of the valley should bring about an increase of 2,252 mu, or 171%. And it kind of drops off the page here in the conversion to this PC. But the Ministry of Land and Resources has a national policy right now that encourages the conversion of what may be termed wasteland into land that will be cultivated. And on a national level, in 2005, when this was going forward, the central government would pay 8,000 renminbi per mu that was converted, and Liaoning province was paying 3,000. So through this project, the construction of it could be subsidized through the land resource being taken from wasteland and put back into arable land. So here's where you get to see a little bit of this village now. That's the first 42 houses of phase 1 of a 400 household overall development that was in that master plan. So this part's been done. You can see the 2 existing other developments are part of the natural, already existing village system within this valley, District 6 and District 4. This is what it looked like last spring when we get to Spring Festival in 2006, actually. And by this point, there should have been 42 families living in these houses. There actually should have been another 150 households finished, and with families already moved in. But when Spring Festival came last year, there were only 2 families living in these 42 houses, and they not by choice. And so instead of laughter and joy watching the CCTV annual program, there was a lot of confusion about what had happened with this project and why these houses were remaining empty and why the building had slowed down so much. And while I could talk with you about many reasons that have contributed to many difficulties that this project has faced and difficulties that are in rural development and economic development overall throughout China. In the spirit of today's this conference, I want to focus on and take seriously the question Tom raised about how do we know data is credible and how do we know it is valid? And on all of the programs that so many of us hope will happen in transforming the environment in China and transforming the quality of life for its rural residents. I hope we all really listened to what Kirk Smith had to say yesterday about the true physical burden that is on many rural residents in China today from the pollution load in the environment. Something needs to be done, and this was an attempt at that. But so it all began from that statistic of that there are 830 mu of land under production in Huangbai. And that from that, the Ministry of Land and Resources would be able to subsidize this construction, we'd be able to bring everybody together, and in many ways you would create a much better quality of life for all of the residents by being able to provide infrastructure. For those of you who haven't worked extensively in rural China, I think one of the very defining qualities of being rural is that you do not have publicly provided services. There's no publicly provided water, there's no publicly provided heat. In this village, which for about 5 months out of the year can get to 30 degrees below Celsius, so it's very cold. If you don't provide your own water or your own wood to burn, your family will freeze, literally. So it's up to you to provide all those services for yourself. But so here's the document where we get 830 mu of land under cultivation. And so I want to go through, to take a moment to talk about how the planners and the designers and the municipal government, how everyone came together in this international, transnational institution, which has received a tremendous amount of press, actually. You know, in this little village, it might seem like, oh, who would go there? In the past couple years, the BBC's been there, Newsweek has been there. Thomas Friedman, if any of you have seen the documentary Addicted to Oil, this village is actually spoken about as part of the solution for Americans' addiction to oil. That if we can get China to build villages, to rebuild townships and do rural development that will take villagers into a consolidated land program and bring them off the grid and use biogas, use solar, that's the solution for rural development. And you know, if they're not using oil, maybe we can too, seem to be some of the subtext of that. But so we get the 830 mu from a government document. This document also details some of the population statistics. But this document, you wouldn't know this just by looking at it, but this document has gone through many hands, and I think it's important when you think of a number. It is never a number. A number is an abstract representation of human relationships. And this 830 mu, I guess to speed us up a little bit, the last time that this number came from a physical hand was back in 1983, when the commune system in this region was first disrupted and the household responsibility system began, and each of the families was allocated land according to the population of their household. Since that time, there have been 2 small adjustments, 1 major adjustment in the land allocations, but there's never been another measurement. Not once since '83. And so when the leaseholds change, what's traded is the actual number of mu which is allocated from the commune before it broke up. And it hasn't been altered since then. This is another way you could get data about Huangbai and cultivated land. And other speakers this weekend have used remote sensing beautifully in Mark's work and in many of the other speakers yesterday, to get at other information which may not be possible through other means. When you look at this satellite image, this is actually only 1/2 of Huangbai. It's a very long, narrow valley. It kind of winds through almost 7 miles. So this is just the southern half. But when you do the measurements from remote sensing, doing multispectral analysis, you actually get 3,862 mu that are being cultivated. And so there's this massive conflict. There's 5 times the amount of land that's actually being cultivated than the government understood, and then the government reports, and that the government used with their international partners to plan and do the basis of this project, of the master plan that we've already seen. But yet, looking at this image, while it does give us an incredible amount of visibility of what is occurring in Huangbai, I would like to offer that in some ways, the greater distance from which we understand what is, in a sense, an anthropogenic use of our land, the more obscure it actually becomes. This looks like it has incredible clear visibility, but it's actually not at all apparent why there is that gap between 830 mu and 3,862. And perhaps it's because I'm the anthropologist speaking today. I think whenever you're looking at anthropogenic changes, you should probably just go straight to the anthropos and start talking to the people. But I think all of these numbers have their place. I mean, part of what I'm trying to get at is you have to understand the numbers that are being used to generate plans, and that is the 830 mu, and then why there isn't the knowledge of the 3,862, and what role the people who are living in this valley and how they've been shaped by land, by power relations, and the needs of production to be navigating in that space. So I lived in this valley for about a year and a half, and after a long period of time, I conducted a 10% household survey, and it was through that information that I was able to gather the data on when people started claiming their own land, and the two different times that had happened, which areas it happened most in, where it was happening over a 30% grade, and a lot of other details that you can't get through either of those other methods. And so that goes to some of the other authors have talked a lot about triangulation. And where you get your data informs the data you get and limits the types of questions you can both ask and answer. But we'll speed through. So why does this all matter? There are a tremendous amount of national reasons why I think this question is very important. And over the past few months, I've been in conversation with the National Statistics Bureau in that this government records measurement, this is not unusual in that it hasn't been remeasured since '83. That these numbers do come from the village up to the township or the district, up to the municipality and onward. And while the Ministry of Land and Resources does have a program now to be doing satellite remote sensing, the communication of whatever results they are currently getting is not yet changing the government records that are being used by planning bureaus. So why does this matter in the end for local Huangbayu is for the cost of that development, the model village, it would have been 40 million renminbi for those 400 households. And if you skim through here, I've tried to break it down, but in the end, the final analysis, is that the return on investment for the government, if they were paying for this minus the subsidy they'd be getting for the land from the Ministry of Land and Resources, would be 10 years before there'd be any economic benefit in addition to the rural population from the increase they might get. But in reality, given what land actually is under production, it'll take them 43 years. Granted, the benefit in greenhouse gases and the changing to a biogasification system, if it worked, would give immediate results on a national or a global level. But for the people who are to live in this village and who, in essence, aren't granted the mobility to leave it, they're being asked to take on a burden of a 43-year investment from which they will not benefit. And while I don't have a lot of time to go into it, something you should know is that the ACA 21, the agenda for China's, the Administrative Center for China's Agenda 21, their finance director has been very publicly stating that sustainable development is self-sufficient development. And while many of us might grasp that concept and be like, yes, it is off the grid, it is being able to provide energy for yourself, and in eco blocks taking advantage of captive capture and the infrastructure. But that isn't just what he meant, and that isn't just what McDonough has meant. It also means economic self-sufficiency. This model village and that 40 million renminbi cost was to be borne by the residents of this village. And that was the plan for bringing it out across the 600,000 villages across China. And so I'd like, in addition to the problem of the data that changes the calculus of the investment structure for this village, just to for a moment think through who's taking the burden of walking us down that yellow brick road to global sustainability and lowering our greenhouse gases. So what else could a family do with 60,000 renminbi, which would have been their burden to invest? Well, they could have bought 40,000 rainbow trout fry, and after a year sold it for 120,000, doubling their money in 1 year. They could also have cashmere goats. This is another main household industry in the area. They could have bought 171 of them over a 5-year productive life. They could have made a little under 240,000 renminbi, or quadrupling their money in 5 years. Or, like 10 families in this village have already done, which might say something to their understanding of life in the village. They could buy their own home and build their own home of their own design after saving money for on an average of 25 years to do so, still have enough left over to get that mianbao chua, no longer allowed in Beijing, but a critical means of transportation and trade in these areas. Or they could have a wedding for their son and be able to afford the cost of the health care for the newborn grandson they hope is long on the way. So maybe I'll just go to here. So I'll close with just bringing up trying to help us all remember that in all the work we are trying to do, really take the theme of this conference seriously. What do we take as credible? How do we know it's valid? Who did we get that data from? And who does it benefit? And if we think through this global calculus that we all have to work under, if we're going to take global warming seriously. But national plans and global plans, they're not built in the globe, and they're not built in the nation. They're built in a valley or in a very specific plain. And we have to think about how these things that might benefit the globe or the nation in an aggregate calculus may be continuing to put an extraordinary burden on the people who've not yet even benefited from the industrial revolution we're already consuming. So with that, I'll close. So thank you very much.
We are officially at coffee break time, but this has been such a stimulating panel with so many incredible plans, as well as perhaps an interesting reality check on the question of who benefits and who pays, that I think we should open the floor to perhaps 4 questions, and we'll run over by about 6 or 7 minutes.
Thank you. Question for Harrison. I'm curious, in the communities that you're looking at that you've done the design work on, do you have an estimate on 2 quick financial points? For a person buying a flat or an apartment there, what's the approximate cost per square meter? And also, although I don't focus too much on kilowatt hour cost because it's a much bigger story than that, what's your estimate of the power price per kilowatt hour from this?
Is this on? Great question. I didn't want to get into the detail. We have a huge report on this. And we'll actually have a more careful pro forma to work from. But we've been estimating that the flats, the 2-bedroom flats, about 90 square meters, will be around $60,000. And the add-on cost for all of those systems, integrated, everything, the conservation moves, the renewable energy, all the water systems, is somewhere between 5 and 8% add-on cost. And the price point for the electricity that was used, it varies dramatically, and we know that the electricity is heavily subsidized in China. But if I remember correctly, I think we were using about 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So I'd love to hear if those are reasonable numbers. We're going to have much better numbers when we run through this again with all the local folks and all the local utility folks. Those are average numbers.
I just want to have one suggestion. I think probably you already think about that. The super block theory is great. The green building, everything, concept built in. I prefer to see you mix with residential and commercial, light commercial use, because you don't want to move people, whole super large block out of 10 miles, 20 miles away to do the work. And another question is try to say, I would make some suggestion, because I know you generate power, sometimes the power is off the peak hour. So you may want to think about the more efficient use for the energy. For example, you can use the off-peak hour to build those huge ice block on the building. And then the off-peak hour, the peak hour, you don't need to generate electric, you can use that,
There are lots of assumptions and embedded things in there. The first point was which now? Just commercial. Yeah. Okay. The mixed use question. It is a heavily mixed use neighborhood already. There's commercial all along the main boulevard, which is where both shopping and offices. And within the neighborhood, there's a major shop house kind of use on 2 of the major north-south streets. So it is, and there's schools, there are there are 2 schools. There's a senior center. There's a recreation center. There's a sports facilities. There's a whole bunch of the typical program elements that you'd get in a block like that. And because of the bus rapid transit system, you are very accessible to all the major employment opportunities along the route. So you're using a very efficient transportation system and not your car. So this idea of the time, I have about 4 slides on how the timing of the loads work. Qingdao is a very beautiful climate. It's like San Francisco. There isn't a large air conditioning load. If we were to do this in Beijing, where you have a large air conditioning load in the summer and a large heating loads in the winter, we would have a different kind of system in operation. We'd still use those 3 sources of renewables, but we'd use them differently. So that's why it's a good idea. The nice thing here is we can custom fit the renewable systems to a climate system. And that's what's nice about not having just one renewable system. So you can optimize the size. If we were in a place where we had no wind or no sun, we would try to mine the waste streams of the city and up the biogas supply for electricity. We just are using this as a pilot project to just show how much energy you can get out of the waste streams that exist on the site. And actually, we've been collecting empirical data, and there's a lot more waste than we originally modeled there. There's a lot more. What we're probably going to do in the final design is have the biogas up around 20 or 25%, and we'll lower the photovoltaics a little bit and keep the wind where it is. That'll probably be the most cost-effective.
First, second.
A question for Shannon. I really enjoyed all of your presentations. In my work in rural China, I've seen a lot of this new socialist agriculture village going in. So I wondered if you could talk about the relationship between the village that you looked at and that program, if you know if it's part of it or if there's similar trends that you see. And I'd also be really curious to hear more about why it was that it wasn't successful. What prevented people from wanting to move into those new homes?
So first, this program began before the March 2006 official Socialist New Countryside pronouncement, but there have been discussion about the Socialist New Countryside within government channels for years. And that's not even, it's not a new phrase either. Mao was known to say it. It's a tradition of speaking and of engaging change that needs to happen in the countryside that's many generations old. But this project was specifically referenced as being on the vanguard of the Socialist New Countryside program, and was highlighted as being a demonstration village, in the tradition of test something in a place and tweak it and see if it works, and then try to roll it out on a larger way. And within Banxi, which is the municipality which oversees this village in Liaoning, it was nominated as an official demonstration village. They go up the channel. There are 100 model villages. There's this nomination process going on in China right now for 100 model villages, and Huangbaiyu has made it past the provincial stage to be one of those in this official recognition campaign. So it's definitely part of this whole new discourse and new building movement. Many people have said this before, but I think there's a conflation between development and real estate development that is happening in China now, not only in the cities, but particularly in the countryside, where the idea of building a socialist new countryside is sometimes taken too literally. And that it could be built out, and then somehow the economic development will be there in the form of the building. If the building looks modern and developed, then the people who live there, well, they just must be. And how that transition will happen, I think, is the big question mark. I think there's too much focus on real estate development and not enough focus on what I would consider the real needs of an area like this. And I tried to gesture to it very quickly at the end, but the financial burden that would be put on each of these households is that 60,000 renminbi. And if they were to have that capital, they they don't. Some families have saved for 25, 30 years, and so do have that capital available, but what they're saving for is their son's wedding. Where an average wedding in this village, if you include the bride price, can run you 40,000 renminbi. I mean, it's something you save for a generation for. And if you actually had the capital, if there was financing available, you could make a tremendous amount of money in developing your own lifestyle through the animal husbandry, which is available in this area, which people already practice through trout, through cashmere, through silkworms as well, which they eat. It's not for the silk. But that wasn't the thought, because building the socialist new countryside and how that was conceived of was to build houses and to build a building, because it dovetailed, and I guess this is the real key point, it dovetailed into this global consciousness about global warming. And if, like that Mother Jones article that was out here yesterday, this fear of if the rural Chinese or Indian so-called peasant actually starts consuming how we do, then we lose our lifestyle. And so it was about how do we bring development to a rural place, but keep them off the grid, keep them not getting coal-fired energy, having biogas or having solar energy. But in doing that, this program limits their economic choices, and it puts an incredible economic burden upon them. I'll leave it at that.
I'd like to pick up on this. I've known Shannon now for quite a while and tried to learn from her experience. And so she's so wonderfully precise and academic, so I'm going to oversimplify. The family, it's a bad investment for the family to buy one of those houses. That's why nobody bought one. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's that simple.
Yeah,
it's not rocket science, okay? And that's because their values are in other places. They already have a house. What they'd like to do is increase their ability to have income. So in these new blocks where you're providing housing for people moving in, there are lots of things going on in there, and I'd love to have Shannon go live in one of these things and explain what's really happening, because we've made lots of assumptions, and some of them are based on what she told me. You have to make the residents be an economic engine for the family. If you don't do that, you don't understand even the first thing about these extended families. So we've tried 50% of the houses you can add on to them. Now you can't do that in the gated superblocks. Mm-hmm. We've provided space. You can build an extra room for the son and his new wife. You can build on the side to do something. You can actually grow things in your outside garden if you want, or you can grow it in a community garden. In that community, Shannon shared with me that they have the equivalent, each family, of 3,000 or 4,000, maybe it's more, 5,000 RMB a year in their own food production. Isn't that right? So even though in some areas, the gated communities, they don't allow any of this because it's not seen as modern. Yeah. In some areas, if you provide it and design it in such a way that it's not an imposition, that it's organized, that it's seen as an asset, you're actually using this process to build on some of the cultural norms that already exist. So there are huge lessons in her experience there. And you know what? I can't find when I search who's really analyzed the existing gated superblocks. Now, I've gone to all of them when I've been there, and I've talked to Dean Wu from Tongji. He lives in one of these. And he lives in one apartment, and right across the hall, his mother and father live there. And they help take care of the kids because he has a crazy lifestyle. He's designing the 2010 Shanghai Expo, and he's doing all these things. They have an extended family. They love the gated superblock because it's safe. But it took us 45 minutes to find their apartment. Driving around the outside of this thing and getting in there. So, there's so much to learn from this, and I don't know if the Chinese have studied how all of their social networks are mediating and making the adaptation to this incredibly different physical, spatial way to live from what they have in the past, make it possible. Because look, they were grounded in hutons, I don't pronounce it right, and they had a street culture, and now they're living vertically in a landscape where it's just flowers. How do you make that adjustment? Who studied that? And we're suggesting that there are ways you can use a kind of hybrid model much more creatively and effectively. And I'd love to work with the Chinese folks to do this. I'm an honorary professor at Tongji because we're going to work on this.
Okay. Two more very, very quick questions, 1 and 2, and then I'm afraid we'll have to stop.
The question is for Harrison. And you started me thinking many, many questions, and what you said there sounds wonderful. But what about even alternative energy models? Any energy storage unit that you have thought of? That's one question. And then second is like with the compost, we're talking about recycling. Very efficient way of recycling. And which means that, is behavior changing, is changing habits, and whether the people would be, I would say, disciplined enough to do that, which means that, is involving education and training, and whether you guys have done any market research right from the start, see whether, this whole idea, is acceptable, and that's all.
I'll try to be really, really quick on this. So I didn't want this to be all about the technology systems. And the way we've modeled it economically, there is a vacuum system designed to go into all the units and also be in the courtyards and on the streets so that you can put your green waste and your garbage waste into a container and it's taken back to the anaerobic digester. Now, I'm not sure that's the best solution. It's expensive, but it does pencil out, economically. It might be better to actually have an internal system of collection that pays people to collect this and take it to the anaerobic digester. It may be a better economy to do that. Now, we're going to look at both of those things, and we want to have a developer who is totally committed to this and would be willing to experiment a little bit, because we want to have the developer be the owner-operator, so he or she is invested in making this work and finding the best system. So it's not just dumped on the people and left up to them to run it, that there's somebody who really benefits from making sure this works. So that's the strategy that we're following with all the systems. And we have Hire Corporation involved because they want to help us with the management of the appliances and the management of the temperature and systems in the house. And we may have Siemens do the overall neighborhood thing, because these folks think this is an economic opportunity. This is not only better for the homeowner, but it's also a good thing economically for China. It's going to leapfrog over having to buy from centralized infrastructure. You can control it yourself, have an economy inside there. Every time we run it out, it's a benefit for the developer. So the other thing I want to say is we saw this wonderful data. This conference has been an eye-opener for me. This wonderful data about urban land. The hidden idea that's why I ended on it, we're trying to have the landscape. That site has 200 units per acre, which is more dense than most cities, than the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It still has 50% of the land area you can grow stuff on. So we're trying to get rid of the idea that when you have a city, it's concrete, and when you have the countryside, it's green. We're trying to put those two things together and really make them have a synergy and productivity together. And we're trying to do it at very high densities, which is what that project is.
A final question.
Yes. Sheldon Brown, who I don't know, seems to have a taste for the absurd and the dark. And I'm wondering if you would consider turning your talents to make films that would expose the real consequences of the Huang Baiyu development, for example, the real price that people are paying, or the real cost of these superblocks, or from Ma Zhong's explication of the pollution maps, if you would care to expose some of those using your talent, because you do have a taste for the absurd and the dark, and it might do people good to see these real social facts using your medium.
Well, the real social facts are probably absurd and dark, and but I think more to the point, one of the things that we've seen with the two case studies here is they're complicated. They're very complex systems. The results are, not what, in the village, the results are not what are expected from the simple modeling. And the thing that's also struck me as really very interesting is that the place that we're starting to get the data from is from this view sitting on the moon. And so we're starting to get information from the moon about what's going on Earth. And in order to make systems like this really be able to participate in discourse, the story needs to emerge from the ground. And so what I would hope is that, to be able to then tie that kind of emergence, we still need the moon view, but tie the ground view and the moon view together with these kind of systems of visualization that I'm developing is what I'm advocating and moving towards. So I start off by making these kind of provocative, shots in the dark, but it's the early stages of the development of this form and this medium, and this is one example of many things. Go to my website and you'll see some other things that are a little less just about provocation. So.
I think that's a terrific way to end an absolutely wonderful panel. The moon and the ground being jiehud. Thank you very much. I believe it's time for coffee.